Our Pastor Emeritus, pastor here at Calvary for 24 years, and he's going to be sharing tonight part 2 of a miracle story that God did. I trust some of you I see weren't here with us the first time, and so if you didn't, we'll have it on recording to hear part 1, but part 2 of the miracles that God did here at Calvary Church. Would you welcome him as he comes, Pastor Griffith?
Thank you. Well, I remember that we had a letter from one missionary who was receiving the cassettes from the church, and it was an SOS. He said, "We've heard that tape 100 times. Please send us another." One year, Mrs. G hit upon the idea of having art competitions. So she had art competitions for the listeners. The bravest deed in the Bible, the kindest person in the Bible, the most wonderful miracle in the Bible. And one year, there were 3,000 entries for the competition. And Mr. G, I remember, spoke one morning from the pulpit. And she may have mentioned that. And there was a student in the congregation from England who was here doing his master's in law, as it turned out. And after the morning service, he came to Mrs. G and he said, "Mrs. G, I'd like to help you." And my wife said to him, "Well, you've got your studies. You haven't got time." And his reply was, "You've got time for what you want to do." And this student came at 9:30 on a Wednesday morning and worked until 12 o'clock. And he tabulated all of them and put them into 3 classes. And I remember that Mrs. McCrory was the lady who eventually decided who would be first. And there was a prize for everyone for entering. And then there was a prize of free cassette for 12 months and 6 months and 3 months. So this was very, very personal and was part of the success of this huge Sunday school that my wife was running at that time. And I mentioned last week, and I'll mention it again, because Tim Dowdell is here. Stand up, Tim, if you will, please. Tim was and is the son of Howard Dowdell, who was one of the missionaries, and I told you the story of how Howard was, during the Civil War in Liberia, running SIM. And the boys, 4 of them, were having the cassette from Calvary Church, and the 4 of them were flat down on the floor listening to the stories. And Howard thought to himself, will the Africans really listen to these stories? Well, being an engineer, he was very scientific about it, so he sent some out into the bush with a cassette player and cassettes to see how the Africans would respond. I said that last week, and the result of that was that Mrs. G had an enormous listening audience in Ghana and also in Nigeria. Mrs. G had at least 100,000 young people that she was sending books to in Ghana. But I didn't tell you last week, and I think I should tell you, that Mrs. G had an offer of marriage from a farmer in Nigeria, and she made an offer that nobody could reject. He told her that he had 48 cows. And I think one of the most amazing stories is the stories of the work in Cambodia. You remember that the era of terror, the killing fields of Pol Pot. And I remember that it might have been just about 1999. Mr. G got a letter from Tidua in the US asking for permission to have all her stories translated into Khmer, which is the language of Cambodia. And in that letter, the man said, the country's brutalized. It'll take a generation before they become human. It was an awful state. Well, Transworld wanted Mrs. G's stories to be translated into Khmer. And as is the practice with Transworld, they always use nationals. And the girl, Carrier was her name, she was 17 at the time. She'd never told a story in her life. And she has turned out in the last 17 years to an amazing leader. The stories have been translated, and after a run of 10 years, they re-recorded all the stories. They have no regular mail service in Cambodia, but they have an average of over 1,000 letters every month. They started off with shortwave, which reached the whole country. Now they're working with FM, and they're using boxes where they have programs recorded, and these boxes are used in the villages. And all over Cambodia, they have groups listening to the stories. We got a picture the other day. There must have been 50 who were being trained to use these boxes to gather children together in the village to listen to the stories. And that ministry is an enormous ministry. They now have a prenatal and a postnatal service, all kinds of marvelous services. Well, you say, how did that start? It started in a very simple way. Michael Bentley-Taylor, Dr. Michael Bentley-Taylor and Mvanui, this is 20 years ago, were traveling in China and in Southeast Asia, encouraging missionaries belonging to the OMF. And Mvanui always took with her a bag of the cassettes to give to the children of missionaries. And when they got to Cambodia, she met a lady by the name of Ella Blossom, who had been brought up in Cambodia and spoke Khmer fluently. And she had thought up the idea of a broadcast story ministry. And Mvanui told her about her mother. And Mvanui left with her the Adam and Eve cassette. And after she left it, she worried because she'd given away her last cassette and she wouldn't have another cassette to give in the next port of call. Well, Ellen Blossom listened to this cassette and she said, this is what we need. And that's how that ministry started. And the result of that is that Mrs. G radio program also started in Nepal, and there were also contacts in Indonesia. So that's the story of a growth in radio. And together with that, there was the ministry in books. And I told you last week that Miss G distributed 500,000 books in response to the radio program. And then there were the cassettes. Actually, it started with gramophone records, if you please. And then there were cassettes. And then there were CDs. Well, we suddenly began to get a lot of letters from the blind, Braille letters. We didn't know how that had happened. But actually, we had 1,000 Braille letters. And we didn't have anybody to transcribe them. We phoned the Canadian Blind Society and said, "Oh, yes, bring them here. We'll transcribe them." And when they discovered there were 1,000, they said, "Oh, no, we can't do anything about that." Well, we had 1,000 Braille letters. And what were we going to do with them? Nobody could transcribe them. And then we were invited, Mrs. G and I, to be the theme speakers at the missionary conference of Calvary Church in Oshawa. And in the course of the conference, a lady came to us and said, "You know, I have been trained to teach Braille. The government invested in me to teach one girl, and that girl has now left. Do you know of anybody who could have any use for the skills that I have?" What are the actuarial possibilities of finding somebody like that? But she transcribed those letters. And the thing grew. And if I may just, is that picture on? Yes. Now there's a picture of Mrs. G and Cliff, his name is there. And the story I will tell you in a minute. But you see what it says. Cliff's fingers speed over the Braille. He's blind and he can read Braille. While he talks the message to us, over 2,000 blind listeners correspond with us in Braille and receive a cassette, free each day, free each time they write. 1,300 are in the Cassette a Month Club. These two, thank you for helping in this unexpected ministry. Just arrived like that. That's the Lord's doing, don't you think? And it's marvelous in our eyes. And now, of course, we have CDs, and in addition to that, we have the web and the internet. And now the stories are all over the world. And it's just incredible. It's the Lord's doing, and it's marvelous in our eyes. That's the growth of it, and I'll say some more about that in just a few minutes. The support of it. How does a ministry like this get supported? It's all on free airing time, and it's now in its 44th year. It must be one of the longest, lasting the longest of radio programs. And the question is, how does it get funded? When we were at this conference I talked about earlier in the States, we were downstairs in the display area, and you wouldn't believe how many things there are available for running an office and running studios, etc., etc., and books galore. And we were walking along an aisle, and I heard somebody say, "That's Mrs. G." And two well-dressed young men pulled up alongside and said, "You're Mrs. G?" And my wife said, "Yes." "And you have a radio program?" "Yes." "Do you have fundraisers?" And Mrs. G said, "No." "What do you do then?" "Oh, we pray." "Does it work?" Well, it has worked, and it's been quite a spiritual experience to watch God providing. As I indicated last week, Robert McClintock started it off, and people in the church here very kindly gave to it, and we had dinners and we had a quarterly newsletter, and bit by bit we built up a group of friends who were praying. The policy of the ministry was the faith policy. Tell God and tell his people. And we did that. And Mr. G would say, if we don't get the money, God doesn't intend us to do it. And it was as simple as that. But it was a great experience to watch money coming in from all kinds of sources. I remember one day, soon after we'd moved into the granary, a man came and he said, "Look, God has been bothering me for the last 2 weeks to bring this check." And he handed the check, and it was for $20,000. God did that. And there were times of need, but every time there was a provision. We had a man on our board at that time called Ed Payne, and he was active with the Christian Blind Mission. And he gave a cassette to the president's wife. The president lived in Germany. And when she listened to the cassette, she said, "That's what we need." So we were invited. We were on our way to Kenya. We were invited to make a side trip to Germany. And I remember the day before, my wife said, we've got so much to do. We can't afford the time to go to see the Christian blind people. Because we didn't expect them would do very much anyway. And so I cancelled it. And then we were coming down over Holland, and the tulips were in blossom, and it was a lovely morning. And Mr. G said to me, "It's a pity we cancelled that, isn't it?" So I said, "Well, we can reactivate it." So they said, "Come," and they were very kind, and they met us in Frankfurt. And the following morning we met the president, and he said, "We've lost our vision. As a mission, we were ministering to the blind spiritually. We're not doing it." And he talked to Mr. G. He didn't talk to me at all. And he said, "What can I do for you?" And Mr. G then said that she would be glad if they'd help with cassettes for the blind. He said, "Is that all you ask us to do?" So he said, "You need an automatic typewriter." Mr. G said, "We've got one." "Well, you need another." "You need a secretary." "We've got one." "Well, you need another." And that mission supported us to the tune of $36,000 for 6 years. Like that. I remember a day when our agents in Chicago phoned and said, "Do you people intend to continue broadcasting?" And I said, "Yes." "Why do you ask?" "Well, your tapes are rather fuzzy, and they'll soon not be broadcasting quality. I said, what can we do? And they said, well, we can clean them up for you, and we can digitalize them. And I said, how much? And they estimated $50,000 US. And our dollar was at a discount at the time. And that meant $80,000 Canadian. So my wife was sitting she was working the next desk to mine, and I told her about it. Well, she said, we'll have to start to pray. And she gave it a name immediately, and that was Save the Soundtrack. So we prayed, and that night we prayed, and in the morning we prayed. And 11 o'clock the following morning, my wife got a phone call from some friends in the States who had brought their children up on the cassettes. And the lady said, Mrs. G, when are you going to give us a project to support? Well, my wife wouldn't give a project if she didn't have it, so she hadn't given them a project. And then she thought, shall I? And then she said, well, and then she talked about what was happening to the tapes. Oh, she said, I'll call my husband. Well, he was a retired lawyer. And he said, look, those stories will be going long after you've gone to heaven. You must preserve those. So he said, how would it be if we gave you half the money and you asked your supporters for the other half? Well, I said, we don't ask anybody. So that was it. The following morning at 11 o'clock, he came on the phone and he said, the Lord has told us that we've got to pay it all. I'll send you a check, US, $50,000. That's true. It happened. And when we bought the building, which we now have, we didn't have the money for it. And I was in the UK for a conference, and I was sitting opposite a well-known Christian leader, and he asked me about my wife and what we were doing. And he then said to me, well, he said, I'll send you a check. And he sent a check for £10,000, which turned out to be 22,200 Canadian dollars. And he did it twice. Now, that was the experience. How do you account for it? It's God. And we need to know that God is in the business of funding his own work. As Hudson Taylor used to say, what God orders, he pays for. So we found that God just pays the bills. But not only when you're running a mission, do you need money? You need people. And it's been amazing to see how God has supplied people. When we bought the building, which we presently have, it needed a lot of work done to it. Actually, we thought we ought to have an architect, and the architect wanted $7,500. And one of the men in the congregation here, Jim McClintock, said to me, he said, you don't need an architect. Work along with it. So we got started with it. Well, as I say, it needed a lot done to it. And I remember that I told the congregation one morning, I said, we've got to put this building in order. And we're looking for RFA people, ready for anything. And I think it was the best thing I did, because I think the men looked at me and said, he's no good. He won't be able to do that job. But you know that 88 men from Calvary Church worked on that building. And you know that I never asked anybody to do anything. We had a plan. We opened the building on Tuesday nights and Thursday nights and Saturday mornings, and I didn't know who was coming. But always there were people there. And it went first class. Ian helped me a lot. But it went first class because there was a man in our congregation then by the name of Gerber, Werner Gerber. And some of these fast food and food centers that you find on 401 and other places, Werner Gerber built. He was a very professional project manager. And he had started coming to help us. And we didn't have money, so we were putting up old doors. And we had just put a new door right on the top floor where we had created actually a new space. And I said to him, I said, you know, I'd like you to come and see what we're doing. I said, and you don't need to be afraid to hurt my pride, because I said, I know nothing about building. Well, he came upstairs and he looked at this door and he said, nothing. And then I said to him, what do you think of it? Garbage. So, without any premeditation, I said to him, all right, from here on, you're in charge, and we click our heels and do what you say. Well, you know, it went Cadillac after that. And he brought oak into the building. It's gorgeous. And there was only one bit of work that wasn't done by Calvary Church. And I remember that we had to take up the carpets, and underneath it was tarred with tiles. And then the ladies came in, and they worked at moving the tar, I remember. And they were the only ones who brought donuts. The men had nothing. And from Lisbeth Lodge and from the church, we had people to answer the mail. I mean, there were times when we had close to 1,000 letters in a week. And that's a lot of work, and every letter was answered. And because my wife was so organized, everything was tabulated. Every bit of correspondence is still on record on 3x5 cards. Well, who was going to do that? Well, one morning I was coming to church, and right at the corner there at Nisbet Lodge, I saw Mel McConnell and his wife coming out of the Christian Ed building. And I said, how are you? And his wife said, well, we're very disappointed. Mel is retired, and he had a club foot, you remember, and nobody wants him. And he had worked in the post office, sorting mail all his life. So I said, Mel, we'd love to have you. And you know, he worked every day. And he had that place in apple pie order. Amazing. And then when it came to having now to computerize everything, we had Bill Palmer. And Bill Palmer was an expert in fiber optics. I teased him one morning and I said, we can't afford to pay for you. You're $400 an hour. Well, actually, you're just $50 out, he said. I'm billed out at $350. And we've got a first-class data system. How do you account for that? That's God. He's the living God, and he intervenes in marvelous ways. Now, what are we doing at the moment? We're engaged in the work of translating the Mrs. G Bible stories in 5 languages. And we're editing the stories in order to make them suitable for Sunday schools with a curriculum, and in order to make them apt for translation. And we have the task of keeping Mrs. G in the stories. And I tell you, that's a challenge. We had a letter the other day from Australia from a mother who said that she had been brought up on the tapes and she had a lifelong love of Bible in consequence. And she had now a daughter of 7 and another daughter of 5. And she said how they love to go to bed every night with Mrs. G's stories. And then she said, my daughter said to me the other day, she said, Mommy, I love Mrs. G as much as going to the moon and back. That was her way. And we are praying that we'll just keep that special touch. So we need prayer. And Michael Deacon is now working with us, and Michael's got a gentle touch. We need prayer for that. The China project is supposed to be finished by December of next year, and we need prayer for that. I think you know what we're doing, that in China they're now allowed Sunday schools in parts of China. But they haven't got Sunday school teachers because the church in China is an adult movement. And TWR asked Mrs. G if the stories could be used for that purpose. And what's happening at the moment is in action. It's happening now that Mrs. G is teaching every Sunday in Sunday schools in China, because the stories go on the internet in e-book and what's the word I want?
MP3?
Pardon?
MP3?
Maybe, yeah. And so they're downloaded, and the stories are being translated here in Toronto, and they're in e-book, and they've got 2 actors on the job there, and apparently they're doing a very good job. And likewise in Persian, and as you may know, there's a great movement of God's Spirit in Persia at the present time, especially among the MBB, and that means Muslim background believers. When the Shah left in 1979, there were 500 MBBs, converts from Islam. But now there are hundreds of thousands. It's estimated there are 1 million of them. And they're being converted by reading the scriptures. And just imagine how much those people long to get their children instructed in the faith. So the stories are being translated into Persian, into Farsi. And there's a new program that has just started in Swahili in Kenya. And this is an all-African cast. It's being translated by Africans, and it's being spoken. There'll be an African woman who will be telling the stories. And it's estimated that when this goes on the internet, there will be a possible audience of 100 million people to listen to the stories. And what's the future? Well, Mrs. G's image was, we follow the cloud. You remember how the Israelites followed the cloud. And we just follow the cloud and see what God is going to do next. Amen. This is the Lord's doing. It's marvelous in our eyes. And we need to take heart. There are many things to discourage us, but we are living in marvelous days. Through internet, we can communicate all over the world. And the Word of God will do its own work. We covet your prayers. Thank you.